between those men.
There are a lot of indicators if you're paying attention.
I want to go to a good college so I can have a fruitful life.
Annie, you're not going to school like this now.
I think we are 5 years away from never leaving our homes again.
No.
What's happening? What's the matter with you all?
Press the power supply button of the CPU box and switch on the monitor. Wait for the machine to completely load the operating system.
Simple conditioning.
Once the operating system is loaded, a screen called desktop appears. Now you are ready to work on the computer.
Here is a world of communication,
Some behaviors are far more mysterious.
bringing together all people in a new era of understanding.
Why is it that only humans can communicate using symbols?
Hey, wait a minute.
All of a sudden, our lives have become a sort of Tales from the Crypt, Gremlins type of
What's down here?
fairy tale moral story,
This is your grandfather's store?
where a chance encounter that brings the protagonist to an ancient shop of secrets full of eccentric treasures
What is that?
becomes entangled in a devil's bargain, a genie dilemma, a monkey's paw, Chinese finger trap, careful what you wish for type of situation.
Unless and until we have a vaccine, then I suspect that we're going to have to live with some degree of constraint because of the nature of the...
Take it! This part isn't about the virus at all, is it? It's about following orders. Not doing what you're told. Oh, hey, man.
It becomes an enchantment and a trap that redirects the outcome, and an allurement that entices the user with the magic of new possibilities, a new technology, and powers. Ultimately, it's always about power. Remember how it started.
It's to avoid overwhelming our hospital systems. Flattening the curve. In other words, reduce the number of people that die.
Enter in cybernetics. Yes, we dealt with this in an entire section of our film, The Minds of Men. And it's still not that well understood. It's probably the least considered part of our film. It's very murky in many people's minds. All centered around man-computer symbiosis.
Things are going to be considerably better for a lot of people when and if we ever get changed over to an essentially electronic base.
As this network evolved, the internet developed into an artificial nervous system.
The important thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. Let's see how the mechanism works. You see it lifting here, transmitting the message along here, lifting that cam up here, and then shutting off a valve there. That is built into the system. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
It was hard for me to wrap my head around. However, that's certainly not the case within the belt of the industry and the connected, decentralized pool of tech innovators and suppliers and producers, the linear manufacturers of computers and related tools.
One can imagine the neuron being a thresholding unit or processing unit that accepts signals from surrounding neurons. These incoming signals that are weighted according to the connection that they're coming in on, it in turn will now output a signal to other neurons down the line, so to speak. Behavior only becomes interesting from our point of view when we have a collection of such devices. The brain, for instance, is nothing more than a large collection of these neurons which are interlinked by different connection strengths. Here, for instance,
the melding of computers and communication and the switch to digital communication technology, aided and abetted by satellites, the computer technology has been moving in a way that nothing else people have ever known has moved. Here's a field that gets 1,000 times as good in 20 years.
Research now going on will someday permit a network user to log in.
Those who have and continue to work through enormous corporations like IBM and Xerox in creating the base pieces that were to be used.
Xerox, the copier company, set up the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC.
The management said, go create the new world. We don't understand it. Here are people who have a lot of ideas and tremendous talent. Personal computing would burst on the scene exactly the way we had envisioned it.
This is a Xerox Alto computer built around 1973. Some people would argue that this is the first personal computer.
It had the first GUI using a mouse to point to information on the screen. It was linked to other PCs by a system called Ethernet.
Without it,
all of that began in a wave of testing and research that came before the wave of luminaries and icons, the new titans of our time period, who were known and connected to the biggest institutions of this new way, your Steve Jobs, your Bill Gates, etc. All of their systems were built upon things that came before it, things like GUI systems, graphic user interfaces.
These idiots in New York want to show it all to Steve Jobs. I won't do it.
Hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I need you to answer some other questions about the stuff you've invented, the graphic interface.
Developed by Xerox and DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Agency, on the one hand, to serve the pathway that later came to be under Apple personal computers, for instance.
And they showed me really three things. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. Within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this.
This graphic interface stuff was like a miracle back then, and we got it. Steve got it from Xerox, who just turned it all over for us to fool with. Like rich people giving junky old stuff to the Salvation Army.
And closely related, IBM's development of the program personal computer, its software and related devices. Windows software wasn't invented by Microsoft as much as it was tweaked by it, and their business plan was largely a spin-off of functions that IBM envisioned but wasn't allowed to do under antitrust lawsuits and other regulations that prevented them from being a total monopoly. It was a Seattle programmer and software developer who wrote and created the backbone of what became Windows, and it was Gates and his cohorts at Microsoft who bought it off of this software developer for a now stinging sum of maybe $50,000, I forget exactly what it was, a pittance compared to the massive fortune that's come from it.
I mean, give me a break.
You've got this interrelationship between control and institutions and bureaucracy and the innovations and creations and technology that has the power to destroy that.
Lets people from around the world share music files.
And yet when it bounces back, it creates new institutions and new forms of control. It's like a ping pong game, very much an Atari Pong system, back and forth between white hat, freeware, giveaway innovators who joyously upend the playing field and massively, almost instantly distribute benefits to people, free software, access to media and information they never dreamed of. And it's even better when the white hat is gray and it's a Robin Hood hacker, a V for Vendetta, an anonymous leaker, a Napster of free music, for instance, however shady. All of this is interrelated. One side is controlling with licenses and strictures. Another side deals with perception, mediation, the direction of images in the sense of representation, symbolism, the misconstruction of perception, even to the point of idol worship. What are we? What are we pursuing? What are we doing? And yet another side deals with the deconstruction and reintegration, modified by the cybernetic process of input and output, of problem, reaction, and its solution.
The negative feedback from the flywheel to the slide valve letting in the steam. This kept the machine oscillating and turning.
Recorded the total spectrum of human experience.
Interleaked with a computer.
Tapestry woven from the memories of past sensations.
Such a device may also use data from previous experience to predict the future.
Ever growing and unique in each of us.
The existing natural reflexes are essentially part of the same mechanism that can inform all purposeful activity in automata.
An Ouroboros of death and rebirth, of destruction and reconstruction, a repeating phase of life as old as nature and the seasons.
Some behaviors are far more mysterious. Why is it that only humans can communicate using symbols?
The quiet revolution of Silicon Valley wasn't all bad. We gained new powers, new abilities, amazing new things came from it. But those powers came with shackles too, and this was also built into the architecture. It is and was classic alchemy, the formula, solve et coagula, solution through dissolution, where component elements are synthesized into a new form through a process of breakdown, of dissolving, and building back up again, coagulation.
But when you think of it, as the economy is reshaped quickly to take on a more digitally oriented aspect, we're likely to have an employment hangover, or unemployment hangover, I should say.
The economy is not going to be anything like it was. It's going to take a long time to recover. It's going to be, people are going to be surprised at how slow and how fitful it was. It's going to take a long time to recover. It's going to be, people are going to be surprised at how slow and how fitful this is.
There are jobs being created by virtue of the digital platforms, as well as there are jobs being lost because of the loss of faith in the analog system. So the society just needs to change more quickly to this new paradigm.
And that's the lesson that we're all learning, right? Work from home, telemedicine, teleeducation. It's all about technology and a better use of technology. And really incorporating the lessons into that. And probably the best mind in this country, if not on the globe, to do this is, I believe, a true visionary, especially in the field of technology, and that's Eric Schmidt. And we've asked him to come work with us to bring that kind of visionary aspect to government and society.
The first priorities of what we're trying to do are focus on telehealth, remote learning, and broadband. We can take this terrible disaster and accelerate all of those in ways that will make things much, much better.
So in a way, you're making an argument for our technology companies to become even more involved, and even that they will become even more needed going forward if we're going to move towards much more information technology, information sharing, and so on. That goes against the mood that seemed to prevail before the crisis, where there was finger pointing about concentration in the IT sector.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
You're the person to help us do that. We are all ready, we're all in, and we realize that change is not only imminent, but it can actually be a friend if done the right way.
The role here for technology in Silicon Valley has been for decades one of disruption, one of the key bywords of their entire industry.
Technology where something interesting is about to happen. Another transition in the way people will use information and use computers. What we're really doing is building an augmented version of humanity.
New innovators, tech conferences, all centered around the idea of disruption. A word that means by its definition to break apart, to rupture, to throw into disorder, the interruption of the normal course or unity of things.
Well, I have spent my whole life, as you have, being a globalist, believing that free trade and open borders and open economics and so forth leads to peace. And we have much, much proof that globalization has benefited many, many billions of humans in terms of standard of living and so forth. We also see the consequence of globalization in the form of the pandemic. The response is national. And if you look, at the end of the day, when people got afraid, they went to a national solution, not a global solution.
How do you develop a real-time digital infrastructure at a national level?
We're going to have to reimagine how the workplace works. We're going to have to figure out how to get people into buildings that they're fearful of. My guess is we'll have more demand for office space, not less, because people will want social distancing. We're going to have to think about hub and spoke systems where local people don't travel so far.
The systemic beginning to end military-industrial complex participation through DARPA and the shadowy institutions of government and industry cast a dark reflection over the upending of traditional life that we've seen in the digital age. this stage of undermining and destroying the thoroughly corrupt institutions that govern life and reconstituting those functions with systems, artificial intelligence, algorithms, and data tracking. All the benefits and the pitfalls of technology.
You can't participate in this new economy without access to the internet. It's how you're going to learn, it's how you're going to deliver services, it's how you're going to market. By the way, it's how you're going to sell.
Another area is education. We went to remote learning overnight. That's what happens when you close the schools. Okay, all the students go home, we're going to go to remote learning. Well, what is remote learning? And we weren't really ready for it. We had all talked about it, thought about it. There was some, but we were not really prepared to do it. How do we really learn those lessons? And we went to Bill Gates, and he's going to work with us on reimagining the education system. And I want to thank him very much. How do you create a testing and tracing system? Yes, we have to do this for COVID, but we're not going to go through all of this trouble and then just forget it. This will happen again. Some people say this virus comes back in the fall or the winter, or there'll be another health emergency. But Michael Bloomberg has generously said that he would work with us and use his philanthropy to develop that testing and tracing. And then on a larger scale, how do we really use new technology in the economy of tomorrow?
You know, corporations are being forced to try to do things in a different way right now, but many of them may use this as an excuse or as an accelerant to make some big strategic shifts.
This 1 month, 2 months period has brought forth 10 years of forward change. So all of a sudden, the internet is no longer optional. It's fundamental to doing business, to operate, to live our lives.
Through a process of breakdown, of dissolving, and building back up again, coagulation.
Let's be a little bit grateful and think about what your life would be like in America without Amazon, for example. The benefit of these corporations, which we love to malign, is profound. And I hope people will remember that when this thing is
Well, we
finally
wouldn't be
over.
here today, for example.
That's right. And so let's be a little bit grateful that these companies got the capital, did the investment, built the tools that we're using now, and have really helped us out. Imagine having the same reality of this pandemic without those tools.
And you know how it's perceived. No one does anything wrong, no one has anything to hide, so what does it matter? The change occurs through our response as a population, through an interrelated system of shocks and adjustments, of shock and ultimately complacency. That's Pavlovian conditioning, and it's a backbone of this whole system of technology. Because the conditioned animal, the conditioned human, and equally the conditioned computer learns through traumas large and small, trials and errors, that are scheduled to occur randomly and unpredictably, yet are consistently to be expected. And these stimuluses, these shocks, have lulled said animal, said computer, said man into a state of compliance, of obedience, and the kind of trust that comes with blinders, obliviousness to anything else going on. It's a deliberate process.
What I will say of this virus, I think we're in the middle of a massive experiment. The experiment is, will people listen to scientists?
For our own good.
For our own good. And if we all paid attention to what scientists say, maybe the coronavirus will just blow on by with a minimum of cases. And then we kicked its ass for obeying the recommendations of scientists.
But the people who've quarantined and who've been meticulous and vigilant and so on, who've not been infected, in fact, we're saying, well, maybe they're at the highest risk once they come out of their quarantine and of being so obedient.
There's inherent risks in this situation.
Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people. You know, to be clear, we're trying through the shutdown in the United States to not get to 1% of the population infected. We don't want to have a lot of recovered people. I believe we will be able to avoid that, having this economic pain.
It's a deliberate process with predictable results. Each new stimulus on the screen produces a reaction and a modification, however slight, in behavior. Obviously, these modifications, these notifications, are reproduced countless times over. Technocrats since at least the 1930s have been talking about conditioning the population, conditioning their own members, conditioning the public through the technology and to use the technology and to be shaped around its framework. And this creates nervous system reactions. This creates a physiological and psychological reaction to these stimulations. This is integrated into your thinking, your anxieties. It's integrated into your physical system, the way your body reacts to stress. It's total. It's really dug in there, and it's really been scientifically worked out. That's what we covered in Minds of Men. And as with everything on the screen, this happens through these intermediaries. The stimulus comes through the medium of the screen, whether it's the cell phone in hand, whether it's the computer on your desktop, the laptop, or any of the wearables and integratable technology that's yet to come. So all this is sort of a setup to move into some quotes I came across in the vein of cybernetics, the development of computers and the related technology, and the deep study of the interrelationship between the computer and the human brain. Backwards and forwards, a two-way street, what they've been working on with cybernetics the whole time. So the University of Virginia put together a timeline, and they point out basic facts. You probably know this. In 1969, the first node of ARPANET is installed at UCLA, and it branches out to several other key universities. It's an early forerunner of things, but it becomes the backbone of the internet. The next year, 1970, the Mansfield Act prohibits DARPA funding of projects without direct military applications. Does technology connecting people? Does something having to do with society and populations and academia, peer-to-peer research, communications? Does this involve a military application? I guess that depends on how you look at the situation and probably who you ask. 2 years before all this, Doug Engelbart introduces computer researchers at a conference near San Francisco to the graphical user interface, a computer screen with windows, and to the mouse, transforming the quote computer display into the surface of contact, the interface between human and machine. At the same time, Engelbart's Augmentation Laboratory, which was ARPA funded, began to use the computer as a means of human-to-human interaction with primitive electronic mail, collective journals, and group interaction. 2 years before all this came the first annual symposium of the American Society for Cybernetics, and it involved pretty much all the still-living cyberneticians that we covered in the Minds of Men, the people who are connected to the Macy's conferences. And this was in 1968, the year before ARPANET. These 1968 proceedings for the American Society for Cybernetics were published under the title Purposive Systems, edited by Heinz Forrester, who we covered in the film. This cybernetics meeting came just a blink of the eye before the launch of the first node of ARPANET, the Department of Defense project incubated by universities across the nation that would become the backbone of our modern internet, created by the military, created by a military research project. It wasn't similar, it was the same.
Research now going on will someday permit a network user to log in.
It looked like
Let's take a map. Any map.
So we have the human operators surrounded on both sides by very precisely known mechanisms. And the question comes up, what kind of a machine have we placed in the middle? What kind of a machine is man?
The meeting was the major culmination of a generation of cyberneticians who had gathered in private under the Macy's conferences and other spin-off groups since 1942. Margaret Mead, the famed anthropologist and Department of Defense researcher who was at the core of these Macy's cybernetic meetings, lamented over the developments that had come to a head in 1968. A new generation, a new paradigm of culture, and a new group of younger cyberneticians taking over for the old guard. And she's quoted in the Purposeful Systems books, which reads, Mead from Symposium Proceedings. I have just lived through a conference where I found myself wishing nostalgically for the dear old days of the late 1930s, when the only people one had to worry about were communists, who had clearly defined goals which were different from your own. But in this recent conference, there were groups of young people whose only goals was to disrupt, who called meetings and then discussed in public such questions as whether they should stay in the conference and subvert it or walk out and get more publicity. When one asked what their aim was, they had no answer, only a loose rationale of the desirability of disrupting all the establishments, even the ones they had themselves created. As the University of Virginia timeline page LSD, Mind Control, and the Internet, a chronology, thus notes, the period of development between this American Society for Cybernetics meeting in 1968 and the launch of ARPANET in 1969, and then the launch in 1971 of the prototypes of the first graphical user interface personal computer, was tightly bundled together, both in time, space, and spirit, under projects to modify and re-script human behavior, to alter and disrupt. A project that started under military design, but which always had implications for general society and indeed the entirety of humanity. Of all the tools in their kit, it is the conditioning process, input, output, the stimulus and response, which gives the most wiggle room, the greatest potential for change, for quote-unquote improvements and quote-unquote advancements in the human system, whether they in fact benefit the populations of humanity themselves or just the prerogatives and directives of those at the steering wheel, of those at the helm. Today, we've seen the moment where all society grinds to a halt over news and media reports, general health warnings, schools, businesses, and shopping is upended. Brick-and-mortar establishments of everything but groceries is suspended. People are out of jobs and money and everything but possibilities, and only online commerce can take place. Delivery systems are overwhelmed. Education, training, and meetings are all forced to take place across video conferencing platforms and computer screen instruction. Digital currencies are being introduced, and there's a new dependence on the logistics of this system in a way that history has never before encountered. Disrupt. Disrupt is the operative word of Silicon Valley. Its affiliated hackers and venture capitalists, pirates, and everyone else connected to it. It's a controlled revolution designed to be an evolution towards their ends. And again, this is part of an alchemical formula that's often repeated. And each turn, each cycle, each chemical process becomes only part of the chain of the greater chemical process for change. Certain powerful planners and shapers have long called for speeding up the slow, random process of evolution under the deliberate directives of a human system.
This 1 month, 2 months period has brought forth 10 years of forward change. So all of a sudden, the internet is no longer optional. It's fundamental to doing business, to operate, to live our lives.
It was a computerized paradise where nothing could go wrong. But something did.
We have replaced every circuit.
Its technology has been perfected, and an incredible new world has been created.
You can experience anything you can imagine, and a few things you can't.
My night to your pawn.
Certain series robots work together to make your wildest dreams come true. You can take risks, face danger, defy death. All in complete comfort and total safety. Safety, safety, safety.
Government is operating because we got here without any information. They're just making stuff up. They don't know, right? They have these aggregate models. What I want to know is I want to know, how can I trust you? So you show up and you're wearing a mask. That's trust number one. We take your temperature. That's trust number two. But presence of mask and the presence of temperature, lack of temperature, is not a sufficient predictor that you're not a spreader.
Infected.
Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because you don't want people moving around the world.
It's not so much a system of people, but one of people in a system, being managed by the authorization and validation of their online profiles, personas, accounts, avatars, intermediaries. Indeed, an image of the self, replicated as many times as needed.
Substitution.
For every individual in the digital collective of the human race.
They're creating and programming duplicates of real people.
She's a replicant, isn't she?
Even those of us who create them can't tell the original from the duplicate.
With most people living their lives through their surrogate selves, our world has become a safer place.
How did we ever reach such a point? It started with a little piece of magic, a hope of something new, unusual, disruptive, something that might be of service to mankind. Let us hope and pray that it serves us well, because stories throughout the history of our peoples have ended with riddled disappointment and close encounters with disaster, unchecked powers and hidden intentions, twisting and gaming the initial innocent contact by a trickster, by a gotcha game, which inevitably becomes a very dangerous episode of playing with fire.
Don't stand there like fatted cattle. Will you answer me?
This part isn't about the virus at all. It's about following orders.